Alright everyone, sorry it took so long, but we finally got this together. So I'm going to give you a rundown of a couple of arguments that I think could be used on the pro and con side of the topic about Cuba. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. These are just some general ideas. Of course, you can flesh out any of these ideas and make them more in-depth than what I've already made them. And of course, you can expand on any of these ideas. You can lump them together. I just really have four main arguments on each side that you can take a look at. So first, on the pro side of lifting the embargo, the United States should lift its embargo on Cuba. The first argument that I would have is U.S. hypocrisy. I think that the United States government and most of its constituents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all live under the assumption that we have some sort of individual freedom and autonomy to make decisions and to do things that we want to. And in a world where the United States has an embargo on Cuba and we literally cannot buy a ticket to fly directly from the United States to Cuba, it is probably hindering on some sort of freedom. I would argue that the United States implementing the embargo because of that continues to infringe upon our individual rights to make sure that we have the ability to go wherever we want. We literally can go to any country we want except for Cuba, and that's probably infringing on some sort of individual rights that we have. Second, we lose about $1.2 billion a year in trade with Cuba possibilities because of the fact that we have the embargo. So simply because the embargo is in place means that we cannot do the trade that we would like to do with them. So current estimates are about $1.2 billion a year. I don't know about you. I could use that money myself. So if we could just open up that trade agreement and allow for us to do that, I could start pocketing some of that money and buying some nice clothes. The third argument that I would make is that they don't get things that they need, like access to healthcare and access to medicine. I think this is probably the best argument that you have on lifting the embargo. There's a lot of people in Cuba who die or have severe diseases, largely because the United States and our medical associations aren't allowed to work in conjunction with Cuba. So when there's some sort of breakout or virus or disease, they really can't get a lot of help from the United States or other nations because a lot of them are allies of the United States, or like NATO, for instance, is largely controlled by NATO and provides most of the funding for it. So when any of those outbreaks happen, it's really difficult for them to be able to do anything. So it makes it really hard for Cuban people to get some sort of the medicines that they need for any of the disease outbreaks, or like, for instance, to be able to get burn cream for all the times that I roast you all. You want to be able to do that in Cuba because of the embargo that we have. So you can go even down to dehumanization with that argument. I think that's probably one of the strongest ones. There's lots of articles out there from medical professionals around the world about how bad the embargo is for them getting a medical attention. The fourth argument that I would make is that lifting the embargo allows for people to travel there, but also allows for like inter-cooperation between nation states. So the United States and Cuba, for example, could play sports. Lifting the embargo allows for sports teams to travel from the United States over to Cuba to play. Wait. This just in, I just found out that after the embargo is lifted, the Portland Trail Blazers are supposed to go over to Cuba and play so they can actually win a game for once. Don't worry, Roro Blazer fan, I've already bought you a ticket so you can go to the game. But after you fly out, we're actually going to reinstate the embargo, so you're stuck over there. Merry Christmas. So those are main arguments on the pro side. Of course, there's lots of them that you can come up with. I think that there's probably a larger leeway on the pro side than there is to the con side. Of course, it's up to you. You could always make the argument of the United States should just be abolished itself, but it's really up to you. The con on this side and saying that we should keep the embargo. So the first argument that I would make is that Cuba is still listed on the United States state-sponsored terrorist watch list for the United States. This makes it pretty difficult for us to lift the embargo on them, especially when we consider some of the people that they've left in. There's a lot of radical activists that Cuba has taken in from the United States, a couple of convicted murderers that they just let in. I'm not sure if the Netflix series Making a Murderer has happened in Cuba yet, but I'm sure that it's on the list of things to do. The next argument that I'd make is that Cuba doesn't honor its agreements. Lifting the embargo, a lot of people hope for would be that we could start trading with them and making sure that we have trade deals going back and forth with Cuba. Yet they've already had their debt forgiven by Russia and Mexico because there was no way for them to pay it back. They're still in debt and have defaulted on their $37 billion loan to the Paris Club nation. So there's a lot of issues with Cuba being able to repay back anybody for anything. So this notion that the United States having all these cool new trade agreements, most likely it's just that Cuba is going to be in debt to us as much as we're in debt to China, something I never thought would ever actually happen. The next argument that I'd make is that the embargo gives the United States ability to leverage over Cuba. For example, that having that embargo, we could say, hey, we'll start lifting some of these things so that we can buy your cigars and your rum now. But in return, for us being able to buy your stuff like rum and cigars, you can't brutally rape people anymore. Like, that's the articulation that we get out of the United States federal government. So the embargo allows for us to lift things very slowly, but also mean that Cuba has to do something in return. So we have the ability to do that. The moment that the embargo is lifted, though, there's no reason for Cuba to listen to us besides the fact that we may not trade with them further anymore. But we're not doing that in the status quo anyways. So there's really nothing for Cuba to gain except for the ability that the United States probably will still trade with them, even if they don't really listen to them on the human rights abuses. The United States isn't ever really strong on that anyways. The last one is that they don't really meet the requirements of the embargo. Back from the 60s all the way up till the 80s and 90s when we updated the Cuban embargo, they haven't met a lot of the requirements of what we require in terms of the Cuban embargo to be removed from being put in place. The main one is the free and fair elections. We haven't really seen that with Cuba. We just saw the power pass to Raul, and after that we haven't seen anything. There's no indication that they've set up anything for free and fair elections. I think the argument against this, though, is like, who is the United States to talk about this? We obviously don't have free and fair elections. I mean, unless you live in Oregon, you literally have to pay gas money to drive to some sort of voting machine, and then you have to wait in line, so you should probably bring your like popcorn and Sudoku puzzles to do while you're waiting to vote. Like, it's not really necessarily free or fair. There's lots of arguments in the United States about how voter fraud has occurred, especially in this last election, or how there's just numerous arguments about the US voting system in and of itself and how it's probably not fair anyways. So I think that them articulating that onto Cuba is probably not a good position for them. But nonetheless, it's a part of the agreement. So in terms of lifting the embargo, they haven't really reached that. But there's arguments on both sides for that. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Enjoy your trip, Rohan. Have fun watching the game. And have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thanks.